We're talking about trauma, and we're talking about multiple trauma that impacts our children and young people in our communities. So you have young people that live in an environment where they don't necessarily have a problem with somebody, but they're told that you don't go to that postcode, you don't go to that area, you don't go to that estate, because there's people that live there that have ultimately a problem with us. So imagine that you've got a 12, 13-year-old that just wants to go to school, but their school happens to be in the area that they're told that you're not supposed to go. So there's that perceived fear that, okay, something's going to happen to me. In order for you to be safe, you might need to carry a knife, you might need to carry a weapon.
So our programme that you teach is part of the jigsaw of youth violence interventions, and they should all be trauma informed. Everyone should be making sure that their programmes are thought through with a trauma-informed lens.
My name is Emmanuel, come from Rwanda, 25 years old. Whenever I get time, I like to play football. Big Arsenal supporter, so yeah. I can relate to trauma because at some point in my life I was a child soldier. For me it has been long journey with trauma. I'm still getting help from therapy.
Most of us would agree that experiencing something very shocking or very frightening could be described as being traumatic. But there is a much wider understanding of what trauma is. A way of defining trauma might be: individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. When we experience some sort of trauma, our internal sense gets overwhelmed by the external threat. Now that can be something that is really very dangerous, or it can be something that we think might be dangerous, so perceived danger, perceived threat. Our nervous system doesn't have the capacity to discern what's real and what might be perceived. So we can kind of look at trauma or the events that lead to trauma as being in two categories. For example, we could look at type 1 trauma as being single event traumas and can include things like war, accidents, assaults, violence, sexual assault, sudden or violent death. Type 2 trauma is more pervasive and often longer term. There are things that often happen to us repeatedly. Some of these things can include emotional, physical or sexual abuse in childhood, domestic abuse, bullying, racism, Islamophobia, homophobia. Essentially, trauma isn't what happens to us, it's what happens inside of us. This means that it's how we perceive the threat, not the threat itself, that causes the trauma. Events only trigger the terror inside.
My parents are at the time they passed away when I was way young. I was basically living with my auntie, and my auntie knew some soldiers, so they were basically going around areas recruiting young people to join the army, telling kids you're gonna train to be a soldier for you to protect your family. And for a few years I was just a child soldier. I was in and out of schools. It's like if I'm in school, that means I escaped training. So on numerous occasions I got caught and I get punished for it. To kind of escape reality for a little bit, I started drinking at the age of 9 or 10. It's they'll give us guns. They were saying that we're gonna go into Congo to fight the rebels. See a couple people just shooting themselves. Or if they're not taking their own lives, they will basically get shot for doing a mistake. People getting forced to do things like people like in training just holding a gun and it's like malfunction of the gun and just by mistake they shoot themselves. I've made a few mistakes, but luckily it was just getting beaten up. I still got scars for it. In order for me to escape, basically they just sneaked me about from Rwanda to Congo to Uganda, and then it was like a bus trip, a few hours. I caught my head while I was just on our way, and I was like, hey, my sister lives in England. From that point on, it was like the search for my sister.
Many of the young people that you work with at Street Doctors are living with the effects of adverse childhood experiences. In fact, over half of all young people in the UK will have experienced trauma before the age of 18. The Adverse Childhood Experience Scale has been developed to help us understand at-risk children and young people and allow intervention at the right time. Adverse childhood experiences tell us that there are 3 direct and 6 indirect experiences that have an impact on childhood development. Experiences of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, growing up in households where there are adults with alcohol or substance use problems, severe mental or physical health issues, loss or separation, or where there is domestic violence present, all this greatly impacts the developing child. As well as these, there is a range of other types of childhood adversity that can have similar negative, long-term effects. These include being a young carer, bereavement, bullying, poverty, and community adversities, such as living in deprived areas, as well as neighbourhood and community violence. Childhood adversity can create harmful levels of stress which impact healthy brain development. This can result in long-term effects on learning, behaviour, and health. When we've had adverse childhood experiences, we don't just forget about them. In actual fact, we carry them in our nervous systems, in our bodies, all the way through into our adult life until we address them, until we look at them, until we learn how to regulate our system that has been overwhelmed due to extremely traumatic experiences. ACEs have been found to be associated with a range of poorer health and social outcomes in adulthood.
Certainly through ACEs, we do understand that people are much more at risk of smoking-related illness, mental health problems, eating disorders, but also people are much more at risk of being exposed to violence. So someone who's experienced 4 or more experiences of adversity, be that neglect or abuse of another kind, are 7 times more likely than the national population to have some sort of exposure to violence, to either be assaulted or assault someone else. When I talk to clinical staff, I always talk about not only the violence but the other implications as well. If we can help people and we identify that risk when the violence is occurring, who knows what we're preventing in years and decades to come. If we're seeing that there's a root problem in adolescence that we can do something about, then we're potentially not only helping their children to stop that manifestation of behaviour, but we're also safeguarding them from high blood pressure, diabetes, smoking related illness. This can all come together as one really, really big package.
For young children, repeated exposure to trauma can impact brain development and literally rewire the brain's response to stress. This impacts reasoning, learning, and emotion. Neuroscience shows us that if our alarm system is on all the time, the neural pathways that connect in these really important parts of the brain break at a time when they should be growing. This is also a time when children are learning how to be in the world. They're packing their survival toolkit full of adaptive behaviours. The stress response stays activated even when there is no apparent harm. As an example, a teenager who has lived through adverse childhood experiences may be very sensitive to seeing angry faces where there are none. In fact, some research suggests that children who have experienced physical abuse are more sensitive than their peers to the expression of anger on people's faces. meaning that they see it even if that's not the emotion being shown. Their brain will skip over the part that can work out whether the person is actually angry and goes straight to high alert strategies.
Their brakes, so to speak, aren't working, and you see a very, very quick escalation in emotional behaviour. You see a predisposition to wanting to get that adrenaline rush or get the stress responses up, to the extent you genuinely meet some patients here who can only function when their stress levels are high, and they almost manufacture an environment around them that's high stress because it's what they need to be able to function.
When a young child's stress response systems are activated within an environment of supportive relationships with adults, these psychological effects are buffered and brought back down to baseline. The result is the development of healthy stress response systems. However, if the stress response is extreme and long-lasting and buffering relationships are unavailable to the child, the result can be damaging.
I think ultimately when we're talking about traumatic experiences, I think the most easiest way to explain it is that there's a rewiring in the brain. So when a young person is faced with a traumatic experience, there's three things that they're going to do. They're going to freeze in the moment, they're going to fight back, or they're going to run.
In the face of interpersonal trauma, all the systems of the social brain become shaped for offensive and defensive purposes. The frontal cortex is the first to shut down. Our reasoning, ability to reflect and think things through gets turned off to preserve our survival. Next, our limbic system gets disrupted. So our sense of play and ability to form relationships become diminished. Even our memory stops working the way it could do. In fact, traumatic memory is oftentimes stored in a completely different part of the brain, as it's so overwhelming for the hippocampus to process. Instead, bits of traumatic memory get filed away in fragmented parts of the brain. But it's our reptilian brain, the oldest part, that kicks in during trauma. This is our survival part of our system, and we are only able to fight, flight, or freeze in this response to whatever is happening to us.
I think it's important for healthcare professionals to understand the impact of trauma, especially as it relates to young people. Because first and foremost is that oftentimes they're children. You know, we're talking about young people that are human beings, that are coming into spaces that oftentimes are alien to them. And you got loads of individuals that are trying to help them, trying to work on them, especially if they've been injured quite severely. And sometimes they just want to try and make sense of that. So it's important to always understand that despite that, you may be there to support them in terms of a physical sense in making sure that they're physically okay. It's also important to understand that these individuals that also might be scared and also don't know what's going on, and also might just want their mum, they might just want a family member to be there.
The sessions themselves, because we're talking about youth violence, are traumatic, and we must recognise that. And we want to be a beacon in terms of ensuring that everything we do is trauma informed and spreading those messages around how everyone who works with children and young people really needs to consider trauma and make sure that in terms of what we offer, that we're offering something that is very, very caring and nurturing and warm, even though the subject matter is in itself traumatic.
So, what does trauma-informed practice look like for you? You only have a short amount of time with the young people that you teach, but you can still be trauma-informed in your approach, and this can be brought into all aspects of your work. Have an understanding of what trauma is and how it impacts people. You've watched this video, so you've made a great start. You understand now how psychological trauma impacts the brain, impacts how we act, and impacts our nervous system. We need to understand how our own childhood experiences impact us. This is a tricky one, but it's really important for you to know what your stuff is in order for you to know what's okay for you to do. For example, if speaking in big groups is difficult for you, ask if you can work with a smaller group. You matter. Let people know what is going to happen, so no surprises. Right up front, let your training group know how you're going to talk about some really distressing things like death and violence. Let them know what to expect from the session, to give the young people the chance to voice any concerns that they might have, or even if they want to leave. Consent. If it's your style to talk about the session in a graphic way, ask the young people their permission. Get their consent to do any of the exercises. This doesn't have to be a big drawn-out conversation, but rather asking if it's okay to touch you when doing an unconscious training, for example. Check in and listen. Ask them how they're feeling about what they've heard and what they're doing. Be kind. You might be the only person that day that has smiled at that young person. An hour can mean a lot to someone who's experienced even just one adverse childhood experience. Remember, these simple trauma-informed practices can translate in everything that you do, and they can make a massive difference.